It's been nearly a couple of weeks since the release of Remnant 2, and I can confidently say that just like the original, Remnant 2 is already a frontrunner for my personal game of the year. There's just something about the Souls-like structure, boss fights, and the exploration/discovery that gets me all excited. And playing through the game on the Nightmare difficulty for my first run manages to offer a level of skill check that we very rarely see in modern shooters these days. And whilst both the public and critical reception has generally been very positive, most of the not so positive coverage tends to focus on the game's performance and optimization, which I have to say is somewhat understandable when you take into consideration that both the AMD RX 7900 XTX and Nvidia RTX 4090 are unable to hold a stable 60 FPS at a native 4K resolution, which is something that we seldom see in titles lacking hardware accelerated ray tracing. To make matters worse, the developers released a statement very early on explaining that the game was designed and developed with upscaling in mind, which has been seen by many as an admission that the game's unoptimized and that the developers were using the upscalers as a crutch. The game's performance has also left many wondering about the true viability of various Unreal Engine technologies, such as Virtual Shadow Maps, Nanite and Lumen, in terms of their performance costs, since so far the games that have featured these technologies have seemed to run at lower than expected performance levels. Or have they? You see, over the past couple of weeks, I've been working on a fairly detailed performance analysis video for Remnant 2. I've played the game for around 80 hours, recorded dozens of hours of performance tests, and written up an over 9,000 word script breaking down the balance between the game's presentation and performance in order to try and come to some sort of conclusion in regards to whether or not our expectations even match up with reality. Unfortunately, this isn't that video. As of a few days ago, Remnant 2 received a patch that invalidated a big chunk of my testing. On a positive note, performance has somewhat improved and the changes do appear to validate my original assessment, so I'm at least confident that I'm on the right track. During my testing, I was able to confirm with receipts a few assumptions that are not only relevant to this game, but games in general, so I'm going to look to repurpose that original video into a video talking about optimization in general, so be sure to subscribe to the channel if that's something that sounds interesting to you. Essentially, I found that Remnant 2 performs around as well as I'd expect when taking into consideration everything that's going on behind the scenes. That's not to say that it's a great example of optimization, or even a good one for that matter, but it's certainly not unoptimized either. Stopping to actually admire the visual presentation will often provide you with some stunning graphical fidelity. Thanks in part to Unreal Engine's Nanite, Remnant 2 is able to pump out some of the most densely packed geometric detail ever seen in a video game. Scenes also feature an impressive number of dynamic shadow casting lights, decent volumetrics and particles, and it's all held together with some great material work. The game also features a very dynamic animation system, awesome sound design, and well-handled procedural generation. Granted, there are plenty of areas that don't always meet these high standards, with unfortunately the main hub and the introduction sequence being two of the biggest culprits, but more often than not, Remnant 2 can be considered a visually impressive game that can hold its own versus some of the very best that the industry has to offer in terms of raw graphical detail. Though I do appreciate that some people are going to disagree with this statement, and that alone goes at least some way to demonstrating why it can be so difficult to have productive discussions about video game optimization. Not only has the word optimization lost a lot of its definition in recent years, with many gamers and creators using it interchangeably with the word performance, but even when we do use it in the right context, there's often disagreements in regards to what it should encapsulate. For example, when I say that Remnant 2 isn't unoptimized, I'm basically saying that there's so much going on under the hood that I'm not surprised that we're getting such low performance. I'm not commenting on whether or not the visuals subjectively justify doing all the computation that's happening, but rather that all the computation that is happening is being done in a relatively efficient manner. Now, if you are of the belief that it's a developer's responsibility to lower a game's graphical fidelity in order to reach a certain level of performance, then it's fair to say that there's a fairly decent argument to be had that Gunfire fumbled the bag here. Regardless which side of the fence you're on, I think it's important to understand that when a game is decently optimized from a technical perspective, as is Remnant 2, then it's extremely unlikely that we're going to see any really significant performance increases such as the doubling of average frame rates through patches alone without negatively impacting the game's presentation. Obviously, it is without a doubt a developer's responsibility to ensure that the game is playable on the hardware listed in their minimum and recommended spec sheet, which Remnant 2 is. But what are the rules exactly? Let's put it this way, if we were back in 2019 before upscaling was even a thing, I would be the first to declare that Gunfire done goofed and that there's no way that a game, regardless of its graphical prowess, should ever be released offering such a low level of baseline performance. But it isn't 2019 and upscaling is a thing. And thanks to AMD's FSR and Intel's XeSS, it's something that's available to the vast majority of gamers regardless of their hardware. It's just that some people seem to believe that upscaling should only really be used to help gamers achieve higher frame rates on weaker hardware, particularly at higher resolutions. Whilst others are in a camp that believes that upscaling is a tool that should be used by game developers to enable them to push graphics to the next level, especially when it comes to technologies such as real-time ray tracing. Technically speaking, upscaling perfectly suits both of these cases. It just seems that, at this moment in time, the majority of gamers, or at least the most vocal ones, tend to be firmly of the belief that upscaling is a tool meant for gamers and should not be used or targeted by game developers in order to achieve playable frame rates. Ultimately, both perspectives are completely valid, and I'd imagine that just like most things in life, the quote-unquote right answer lies somewhere in the middle. To make things even more complicated, we are well over the peak of diminishing returns when it comes to perceived graphical fidelity during actual gameplay. Sure, these graphical improvements are evident in more cinematic games and when you take a second to go out of your way to admire the visuals, but during moment-to-moment gameplay they are often just lost in the chaos. I mean, look at this wall, doesn't it look incredible with every single brick, nook and cranny being represented by actual geometric detail? Now look again, but this time during an intense boss fight. Something tells me that we're simply not going to be able to give it the same level of appreciation that we were just a few seconds ago, despite our systems having to put roughly the same amount of effort into rendering it. This sort of thing also explains why so many people are claiming that the graphical uplift compared to the first game isn't all that impressive, and honestly, I get it. At a glance, even I can struggle to spot the difference between the two games, and I've been putting them through the ringer, so obviously someone that's comparing this game to their mind's eye version of the first is going to struggle too. On a positive note, if I am indeed correct and Remnant 2 isn't horrendously unoptimized, then in the years to come we should at least be able to expect performance is going to scale well with future hardware improvements, something that generally doesn't happen with unoptimized games. And there's certainly already been a small boost to performance in the first patch, and the additional detailed shadow setting does offer some more performance scalability, so things are at least moving in the right direction. During my first playthrough, I chose to focus on performance rather than the visuals, since nightmare difficulty with a level 0 character isn't exactly easy. So I was running FSR performance mode alongside the high graphical preset on a 4K 240Hz FreeSync compatible monitor, and I have to be honest, during actual gameplay, when not actively assessing the visuals, I was more than satisfied with the balance between the presentation and performance. Sure, native resolution would have looked much nicer, that's a given, but I never found the upscaling to be problematic enough to majorly detract from my overall experience. Though I'm not going to pretend that the negatives associated with upscaling aren't exacerbated at lower target resolutions, especially when targeting 1080p, so I can imagine why that would suck. Another thing that I've noticed over my many years of performance testing and graphical analysis is that we gamers tend to only really notice the negative elements of modern rendering whilst being blind to the positives. For instance, the vast majority of modern 3D games have to deal with pop-in and level of detail switching for distant objects. They often have visible shadow cascades, screen space rendering limitations and excessive ghosting due to the heavy use of temporal reconstruction. And yet, in the rare cases where a game is able to avoid some of these limitations, it's as if we don't even notice. So whilst Remnant 2 seems to have virtually eliminated pop-in, level of detail switching and visible shadow cascades, most of the graphical analysis videos that I've seen have barely mentioned these things and instead focused on the limitations of screen space shadows. And to be clear, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. I don't believe that we as gamers bear any responsibility to understand or appreciate what a game is doing under the hood. Much like I wouldn't expect somebody that loves movies to appreciate the work that's gone into shooting certain scenes or the cost of the equipment used. After all, it is a creator's responsibility to deliver the best production possible within the limitations they are faced with. However, there is no denying that things can and do often get messy when we start talking about performance and optimization whilst having these gaps in our knowledge. We have this tendency to expect games to perform better than what they do based on the performance offered by other games which may function entirely differently in terms of graphical rendering, and it's not just a case of one rendering technique being better than another, but rather what technique best fits the design requirements of any given game. Remnant 2 for instance has insanely high requirements based off its core design. This is mostly due to its procedural nature, meaning that it's much more difficult to intelligently cull distant geometry. It also leaves the game unable to rely on pre-baked lighting and global illumination, meaning that all that stuff needs to be calculated in real time. AI likely needs to do more work to navigate the environment since layouts can change drastically between runs, and the co-op element means that the game needs to be able to keep track of the entire level rather than just the section that you're currently active in. So when you compare this to other games that may present the same way but are able to rely on pre-baked lighting, level streaming and more scripted AI alongside less information tracking, it's really no surprise that performance levels are going to differ whilst offering roughly the same level of visual presentation. During this last couple of weeks, I've also had some discussions with people that claim that the performance improvements that we've seen so far basically proves that the game was unoptimized at launch, but again, that really depends on how you define optimization. Yes, it is great that frame rates have increased by upwards of 50% at native resolutions, and I do agree that this is how the game should have launched, but let's not pretend that these performance improvements came without cost. Earlier on in this video, I stated that Remnant 2 has virtually zero pop-in, but since the latest patch, that's not entirely true. Also, distant light sources now appear to render a good 30 to 40 meters closer to the camera than what they did previously, and it appears that there's been a few cutbacks to the quality of volumetrics too. These cutbacks make sense when it comes to achieving performance targets. It's just unfortunate that the way that they've been implemented means that there's currently no way to achieve the same level of visual fidelity that the game launched with, and that makes me kinda sad. Though I do understand why the developers would have chosen to go this route, and again, that mostly comes down to our perceptions and expectations. The SAPPHIRE NITRO RX 7900 XTX is currently the most powerful graphics card in our lineup, and when you think of the most powerful graphics card, you'd assume that means it's going to offer you at least 60 FPS at a native 4K whilst at max settings minus ray tracing. When a game doesn't achieve this, it just feels like there's something not quite right with the situation, and I can't fault that logic since that's pretty much been the reality for well over a decade at this point. But just because that's what tends to happen doesn't mean that it has to be this way or that that should even be considered the ideal. I wish that we could find a way to allow game developers to expose a wide range of expensive graphical settings and features without gamers expecting them to run well on today's hardware. The primary reason why we don't get access to these kind of settings isn't because they are difficult to implement or because they would break things, but rather because developers and publishers understand that their game's performance is likely going to be judged based on all of those settings being completely maxed out, not to mention the volume of support requests they'd likely receive from frustrated customers, not understanding why they are getting such bad performance. I'm not asking developers to ship every new release with the ability to use path tracing or include cinema quality assets and materials just in case we decide to boot up the game in a decade's time. I just want access to a lot of the same scalability variables that are already being modified when switching between graphical presets in the game's options menu. Remnant 2's latest patch quite literally halved the render distance of most light sources, and whilst in many cases you'll likely struggle to spot a difference, there's also plenty of occasions where the difference is obvious or even jarring. Sure, the performance gains are nice, but thanks to upscaling on my setup, I was already able to achieve acceptable performance levels prior to the patch, so from my perspective the patch was quite literally just a large visual downgrade that came with an insignificant performance boost. Ideally, the developers would have simply exposed this option within the graphical settings and allowed us to manually set the light render distance or at least provide a toggle between the patch and launch values. Ultimately, I don't believe that Gunfire messed up in terms of optimization, but rather their options menu and scalability settings, and that is really a massive shame. You know, to be completely honest, I'm not even entirely sure the purpose this video serves. I just feel like, as time goes by, it's getting harder and harder to openly discuss how games perform, or how they look, or whether or not they are optimized, and whilst I personally strive to be open and honest in regards to both my opinions and findings, that really doesn't mean much if we are unable to find common ground in terms of definitions and expectations. But there we have it, there's not really too much more to say. I'm going to make a concerted effort going forward to try and shed some light on the practical realities of video game optimization, and through that maybe we can spark some more productive conversations around the topic of optimization and how it relates to the balance between presentation and performance. For now though, from myself and everybody here at the Sapphire Tech YouTube channel, I just want to say a massive thank you for stopping by and checking out this rather disjointed video. I hope you was able to find some value in it, and if you've got any questions, suggestions or feedback, please don't hesitate to let me know in the comment section down below. But until next time, that is going to be me done for today, so yeah, until next time, I'll catch you later. Bye bye.